On Cape Cod. I'm Malloy. I teach here at SEA, and I have taught here for, actually, you know, I think today might be my 22nd anniversary. Thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure to have you here. So, there are a number of topics that are of interest to me because of teaching at SEA. We run a number of different programs. We actually have 6 different programs, and each of them has an interdisciplinary perspective that looks at the maritime world and at the relationship of people and the sea, and people on islands and on coastal areas. And lately we have really started to concentrate on the impact of humans on the environment, the coastal and island environment. And we have a new program that's called the Global Ocean. And I have the best title in the world. I am the director of the Global Ocean. So this lecture series was an opportunity for us to talk about the historical impact of people, especially out in the South Pacific, which is one of the places that we're traveling to. We'll expand our cruise tracks next year so that in the academic year of 2014-15, the Kramer will do a circumnavigation of the North Atlantic, heading over to Europe, then into the Mediterranean, and back across, so we'll do 2 Atlantic crossings on the Kramer. The Siemens out in the South Pacific will head as far west as Samoa and Fiji, and as far south as New Zealand. So in each of these places we're going to be looking at these issues of humans and their relationship with not just the ocean, but also ocean coasts. So one of the most influential businesses that took Americans around the globe was whaling. And there are several things that I like about whaling as a historian. One is that I think whaling is arguably the best documented industry in America in the 19th century. It is extraordinary how much information we have about whaling voyages. There's not a ship out there that we don't have some scrap of paper that tells us something about the vessel, about the men who were on board, the women who were on board, the wives of captains who, by the middle of the 19th century, were not uncommonly found on board those ships. So it's a business that really took a lot of New Englanders around the globe and had an impact in a number of different ways. So I'm going to start with the first, sort of image. This is an ancient Korean petroglyph, and it is clearly a whale, boat full of guys, and a man there that's got a line attached to the whale. So a very, very early image of whaling, and it begs the important question: why hunt whales? Why go to all the bother and danger of it? This is not a rhetorical question. Pardon? Yeah, they have. The answer is they contain many useful products. So whales have an oily blubber. They have stuff in their mouths that has this wonderful flexibility that, oops. Thank God I'm not in a museum. That would have been really embarrassing. Now I can show just how flexible it is. All right. And people have, all over the world, encountered whales and been interested in them in the many places which they travel. Interestingly enough, in early times, almost all whaling was done in the northern hemisphere, and places where whales passed within the sight of people who were living on coasts, migrating up and down coasts. So for instance, a great example of this is whales migrate up the west coast, gray whales, California gray whales, from the Gulf of California, up along what's now California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska, and into the Arctic Sea through the Bering Straits. And along that way, there were a lot of folks looking at them, and many that decided that it was worthwhile to get some boats out and go and hunt them. So where there were whales passing within the side of shore, there were numbers of cultures that began to hunt them in ancient times. So up along the coast of Alaska, Yupik and Inupiat peoples hunted for whales. They used harpoons that were originally made out of a shaft of some sort. So there is a long stick that sticks into this, and the head of the harpoon had a blade. These are actually metal blades, so the blades themselves are newer, because metal was introduced with the arrival of Europeans and Americans. But these wonderful bone pieces to them were a wonderfully, beautifully designed kind of tool. I show this picture actually because these are all now in the New Bedford Whaling Museum, but the middle one was for a long time at the Falmouth Historical Society. And for decades, it sat in a case there and it was labeled Sailor's Fid. A fid is a tool that's used to rub down the seams of a sail when you are sewing it. So the first time I went in there, I said, gee, you know, that's actually not a fid. That is a Eskimo harpoon. And they said, whoa, we really wanted a fid. So I actually arranged for them to have a swap of some artifacts to get them a very nice fid from the collection of the Kendall Whaling Museum. And this harpoon top then went into their collection. But along with the technology of hunting the whales, there's also a tremendous cultural, wonderful, what do I call that? The cultural software that goes along with the hardware of the tools. And this is true every place that people hunt whales, because it's a really big job and it requires that you organize yourself pretty efficiently. So this is a bowhead whale as carved by an Alaskan native person. And here, this is one of my favorite pieces. This is at the New Bedford Whaling Museum too. This is from the jaw of a killer whale, the pointy part of the killer whale jaw. And it is fashioned to be the bow piece of an umiak, a skin boat. And here it is looking at it from a different angle. It's carved into the image of a polar bear in just a fabulous, fabulous way. And it has a tremendous kind of power to it that becomes your talisman as you're out there hunting whales. I want to say that as we're talking about all this, it's important to acknowledge that whaling, in most cultures where it took place, was part of a larger hunting practice that includes other marine mammals. So seals and walruses are also hunted in the same places where whales are hunted. And there's a tremendous material culture from that too. This is actually part of a bow drill that has a depiction of a walrus hunt. Again, these are the skin kayaks or umiaks that are going out on the ice, and this is a fabulous little tool. This is made out of wood and bone, and then the scratcher part is actually made out of the claws of a seal. And this is something that, if you're hunting seals, you go to the hole where the seals come up to breed, and you scratch on the ice, and it makes the seals down below think that there's friends up above, and sadly, they poke their little heads up it. So it's a very efficient tool. All right, to go back to our question of why hunt whales, they contain many useful products. There is another question to go along with this. How do we know that? Why would you think, as you're standing on shore, and you see these whales moving offshore and spouting, let's go kill those guys, which is going to be a big, big job. How do you know that it's worth the time to do that?
Dead whales.
Dead whales, exactly so, because dead whales come up on the beach. And so on the beach is where people always learn about the products. And so I'm just going to talk for a moment about Europeans coming to New England and then get right to the New Englanders. In the 7th to the 16th century, there were a number of strandings that were illustrated along the coast of Holland. And sometimes they're just sort of the business end of it that you see here. And sometimes they are really trying to understand what's going on in the world if whales are coming up out of the sea and casting themselves up on shore. And this is just wonderful imagery of, it's showing, I should have brought my little laser pointer, but I forgot, so I'm going to try to use this. These are representing eclipses of the sun and moon. Oh, somebody was, Audrey, thank you very much. All right, there's such a workout. Yeah. It was in my pocket. Wow. Okay. All right, so these are eclipses of the sun and moon. It's hard for you to see from where you are, but this is a little thing that's a landscape, and there's wheels underneath it, and it says Terra Modus, the earth in motion. So it's earthquakes, eclipses, nature out of whack is what happens when a whale comes up out of the sea. But nonetheless, there's also guys there cutting it up and seeing that there's plenty of bone and meat and blubber, and the blubber can be rendered down into oil, which the Dutch absolutely had figured out by the 17th century. And this started the Dutch off on a hunt that would take them eventually up into the high Arctic at Svalbard, which they called Spitsbergen. There was a lot of interest around that time and began to grow too in the science of whales, and many illustrations of this over time, some of them sort of getting it right, some of them trying to see from the carcass of a whale cast up on the shore what the live whale was like. And there's a great passage in Moby Dick where Melville says that that's just like looking at a shipwreck to try to understand how a ship works. But if we look at a more modern interpretation of the size and shapes of whales, the ones that were most easy to catch if you're in a sailing vessel were ones that traveled pretty slowly, and then also had a good layer of blubber, which not only insulated them, but also kept them afloat after they were killed. So you wanted something that didn't sink when you killed it, which is a problem with humpbacks, for instance. I think we all know from how friendly humpbacks are how easy they would be to dispatch. But they didn't float well, so it wasn't a big hunt until the 20th century. So the bowhead whale up in the Arctic and its relative, the right whale, in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, were principal whales that were hunted from the 17th century on. And sperm whales, which those were sperm whales that were stranded on the coast of Holland. But sperm whales didn't really become a big item to hunt until Nantucketers found them off the coast here in 1712. And so these were the things that Americans in the 19th century were principally pursuing. When they found out where California gray whales were calving, much to their damnation, they decided to actually go into the bays in the coastal parts of Baja California and find them even where the calves were, and oftentimes would kill a calf in order to get the mother. So there were a lot of things about the business that were extremely wasteful. All right, so to talk about the products again, whales have, let's see, I never can remember this, it's the order Cetacea, the suborder of either Mystacete or Odontocete. And so the mystacetes have in their mouths this stuff, which is called baleen, and it hangs from the upper jaw, and they bring water into their mouth, and then they push the water back out through the plates, and on the inside, it's just like hair. It captures the food. So most of the great whales, the largest whales, finbacks, bowheads, blue whales, right whales, all have baleen in their mouth. Bowheads, which have the greatest baleen, it can be taller than I can reach, from the floor to the height of my hand, and a little bit taller than that. So great plates of baleen. Again, I'm not going to demonstrate its flexibility anymore, but and it gets a little less flexible over time. But it was something that you could actually make a lot of great products out of. Whales are mammals. 50 million years ago, whales lived on shore, and then over time, as they moved into first shallow waters and then deeper out to sea, a couple of things in their evolution made them perfectly adapted for living in the ocean. One is that their nostrils migrated from the front of their snout up to the top of their head. And that's the blowholes that we see. And on a mystacete whale, a baleen whale, there's actually two external blowholes. And on a right whale and a bowhead whale, when they blow, when they exhale, you actually see a sort of V-shaped blow from the two nostrils. On toothed whales, the largest toothed whales are sperm whale, and then smaller ones are minke whales and pilot whales. Whales that have teeth like this one, even though there are two nostrils in there, there's only a single sort of external flap for the blowhole. But this was one of the adaptations that allowed whales to move deeper into the sea, and over time they developed the thick layer of blubber that allows them to travel into deep and cold waters, and they're well adapted now for tremendous depths. Sperm whales, which mostly eat giant squid, which are down in the deep mesopelagic zone. Sperm whale jaws have been found entangled in the transatlantic cable. So sperm whales can dive to enormous depths, and they have various physiological features that allow them to make that adaptation. So just to give you the briefest background on what got started in America, when the Pilgrims arrived, William Bradford, who was the commander of the expedition, not the captain of the ship, but who had become the first governor of Massachusetts, described in his diary as they came into Plymouth Bay that there were whales playing hard all around the ship. And the Pilgrims came from places that knew about whale hunting. And the technology that began in New England was the technology that had first begun in England and then also used in the Netherlands. So the Pilgrims were from England, but they had gone to the Netherlands to get their ship fixed, had left there from the coast of Holland after many months spent in in the Netherlands. So they had learned about whaling technology there from the Dutch. In 1640, they began to set up shore whaling stations on Long Island, and in 1676 in Nantucket, and by 1712, as I said, Christopher Hussey killed the first sperm whale, and things were off. By the 1750s, Americans had begun to make specific adaptations to their vessels, which would make the hunt go even better. So the expansion out to the Pacific happened after the Revolutionary War. If you were here for my lecture last month, I gave a little brief description of why it was that no American colonial vessels ever left the Atlantic Ocean. But in 1791, the Nantucket ship Beaver was the first ship around Cape Horn, first whale ship flying the American flag, and thereafter the bulk of American whaling was done in the Pacific. So what we had there were right whales along the coast of South America, sperm whales along the equator, which whalemen called the line. There were right whales in the bay, the great, what do we call this? The South, the Bight, the
Great Australian Bight.
The Great Australian Bight, thank you very much. And then as they headed up further north, 1819 they arrived in Hawaii, and from there pushed their way up into the Arctic Ocean, starting in the 1840s. So whaling began this very rapid expansion, and they were hunting mostly right whales and sperm whales, and then eventually gray whales along the coast of California. Who's on board? We'll just talk a little bit about who goes on a whaling voyage in the 19th century. And one of the things that might surprise you is that a very good percentage of them were African Americans. So this is a crew list that I came across 20 years ago. I was working on a project looking at the objects that were collected on certain voyages and looking at crew lists. And you can see across the top here, it says this is a list of persons comprising the crew of the brig Elizabeth of Westport, which is down near New Bedford, whereof is Master Pardon Cook for a whaling voyage in the Atlantic Ocean and elsewhere. And each person is signed on board by their name, the place of birth, the place of residence, their citizenship, their age, their height, their complexion, and their hair color. So the captain, we know Pardon Cook is the captain. Pardon Cook, born in Dartmouth, lives in Westport, citizen of the United States, 21 years old, 5'5", complexion black, hair woolly. And the date on this is March 1841. So when I first saw this 25 years ago, I was astonished that there was a black captain of an American ship in 1841. And at that point, Jeff Bolster, who's associated with SEA and a history professor at the University of New Hampshire, was starting to do some work on this. I was then working on a PhD in American Studies at Brown, and asked people if anybody who was interested in African American history had been working on these maritime documents. And the answer was no. At that time, really nobody was using them. But one thing that this gives us, this crew list is linked to the protection paper. And protection is actually protection from impressment. The first U.S. passports that were ever issued were issued to American sailors to protect them from being pressed into the British Navy or the French Navy in the years prior to the War of 1812. In fact, the War of 1812, as it was being debated in Congress whether we should go to war, one of the big reasons for it was that Americans were being stolen off of their ships and sent away in the British Navy. And the numbers that are quoted in Congress were as many as 10,000 Americans had actually been pressed into service in the years between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So what the British were doing, because the British are involved in a lot of wars through that period in Europe, and they need warships. They're involved in wars with Spain, with France. So the ships have about 200 or 300 men on them, and you need to be able to get men to work on the ships who know what they're doing. So the first place where they would send these press gangs was into waterfront bars. And once those are gone, then the next best place to find sailors was on board ships. So they went out, they stopped ships, British trading vessels, which of course British people didn't like that very much, and then American trading vessels and American ships of various kinds. So the US government began to issue passports, and they actually were called your protection certificate. And today when you open up your passport, the first thing you see is your photograph. But since there is no photograph then, what you get is a physical description. And again, this is a description of a man of African ancestry, a black complexion, woolly hair. So the objective here is not to identify people by race, but nonetheless, it allows us to actually create a statistical profile of who's on board. And that's a really valuable thing to be able to do as a historian. Again, it's a kind of document that's really interesting. It doesn't always work very precisely because since this is of physical description, a lot of the guys are listed as dark, inclining to dark, ruddy. There's lots of different words that are used there. But we can nonetheless begin to count up the people on board and see that even from the colonial period and forward, about 20% of the berths on shipboard were held by men of African descent. So this was an important industry for African Americans, and it was also an important labor pool for all the maritime industries, but especially whaling as time went on. So I'm going to take you through a voyage, and these are photos that are in the collection of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And I've chosen them because they have black guys in them, but partly that's just to sort of raise your consciousness to think about who the men are that are in the workforce of these various voyages. So this is the bark Kathleen as it's prepared for a voyage in New Bedford. And the photographers could come on board. Well, guys are still dressed up in their fancy clothes. This one is also just a little nod to the music that was done on board, which I will talk about again. Let's go on a whaling voyage, though. We start on a vessel that has a lot of work to do on it. And the things that are recognizable about a whale ship is that it has these boats on davits that are hanging outside the wall of the ship so that they can be lowered when you see whales. This is a square rigger, so you can see that these are the guys that are standing up here on the yards ready to handle sails. And when you get out to the whaling grounds, there was a big job to do, which was up way at the top of the mast, where you go up and you stand with a hoop around your waist, and you balance on two sticks. I shouldn't say sticks, two boards that come out. Your feet are on those, you've got this thing around your waist, you're getting yourselves comfortable, and then you get out the binoculars and the telescope, and you are looking for whales to come to the surface to breathe. Again, they're mammals, they have to come up to the surface, and when they come to the surface and exhale, then the exhalation of their breath condenses in the air, and also whatever water is sitting on their head shoots up into the air, and so you get this very recognizable blow. What do you say at that moment? She blows! She blows! Right, and down below on the deck, people say to you, "Where away?" And you call back down, 3 points off the starboard bow, about a mile off, and now begins the great part of the hunt. On the left, we are headed out to the whale. If you have ever been rowing, you know that when you sit in the boat and you get the oar out and you start to row, you go backwards. So you're not facing the direction that you're headed. So in the case of a whale boat, there are 6 men in it. The man at the bow oar is the harpooner. The position is actually called boat steerer because once the whale is struck, he's going to change places with the man at the stern, who is the officer. And the officer is operating the steering oar, and you can see a guy working the steering oar there in the stern of the boat. And when the whale is right in front of you, when you get right up to it in that boat, the officer will call out to the man at the bow oar to stand up and turn around, and there's usually a notch or 2 notches right there that you can balance yourself in, and you pick up the harpoon and you thrust it into the whale as hard as you can. This guy on the left, it almost looks like he's gonna, this is a posed picture, so he's showing what it looks like. But what happens after that, you're in this small boat, which has been lowered from the ship. So you're in this small boat, you strike the whale. The whale, in its fear and pain and surprise, usually takes off. And at that point, you have all the line attached to that harpoon in tubs in the boat. And the line starts to race out of the boat and through a little notch in the bow of it. And the whale is taking you along on a ride. You lift up those oars so that you're not going to get them tangled in the line. And this is what's called the Nantucket sleigh ride. Off you go, attached to a whale, going through the water. When the whale finally tires out from loss of blood and from towing a boat and 6 guys, you start to pull yourselves hand over hand up to where the whale is. And that's the point on American voyages where the 2 guys in either end of the boat trade places. And the officer goes forward to strike the blow that will kill the whale. And the objective is to get the lance into the whale's lungs And you know when the whale has been struck in that way because blood will come out from the blowhole. And I would just show you something about the technology of harpoons. In the Arctic trade of British whalers, they had these two-flued harpoons, extremely sharp. You carry a blacksmith on board to keep these tools at a sort of razor's edge. The problem with that is that it goes in, it's a big head, it can cut itself out as well as cutting itself in. And so you don't want the harpoon to come out of the whale or all that effort is lost. And so over time, they developed a single flued harpoon, and that, hopefully you could get that in, get it under the blubber and have it stick like a fish hook. And in 1848, an American blacksmith named Lewis Temple, an African American, developed a harpoon that could toggle out like this once it was in and open up inside the whale, and that would then hopefully keep you attached more securely. But it was always a problem that you might lose the whale that you had spent all this time and effort to secure. And in the images that we see of this, the danger of this part of the hunt, when you're actually in the small boats away from the ship, are illustrated by, in this case, on the two left pictures are by Louis Garneray, a Frenchman, who was particularly praised by Melville in Moby Dick for getting it right. And then American images. But I'm going to read a poem to you by a guy from Falmouth, Rupert Swift, and he wrote a poem in his logbook about this particular moment in the ship. He was on the ship Contest of New Bedford. The whale was off at a furious pace, and the whale was fast to the boat. My collar was open wide at the throat, and I felt the wind on my face as we followed the order to face about and haul and surge on the line in the furnace heat of the fierce sunshine. And we all turned to with a shout. Head and eyes out, the great whale ran, a black spot far in the lead, dead to windward with furious speed. And we were drenched to a man, for a smothering, curtaining cloud of wet hung at the bow, and convex walls like two inverted waterfalls o'ertopped each rail like a parapet. Two smooth walls of glistening green, as from an emerald chiseled and cut. The sleek sides hissed as we passed between, and the boat slid on in the gleaming rut, in the wide foam road of the whale's wake, laid on the tumbling wave hill's wide expanse, that vast blue prairie devoid of shade. Then the mate went forward to take the lance, and the mate yelled, "Wood and black skin," when he stood in the whaleboat's bow. "Now pull me up to that whale," he said, and he dashed the sweat from his brow. "Just lay me on and give me a set, and I'll make it worth your while, for the whale that's running ahead of us there has 100 barrels of oil." He had a New England accent. "Wood and black skin," the mad crew yelled, as wildly they tagged and hauled. "We'll beach the boat on the whale's bare back," and we staggered and strained and bawled, and as we took in the wet line slack, when it reached the tub oarsman, he threw it out in the boat's churned track where the white foam eddies ran. Shoulder to shoulder we pulled with a will. We lost, we gained, we lost, as the blistering line slipped through our clutch when the flying boat was tossed. But inch by inch we got it back, 3 fathom for one that slipped, though once we fell and rolled in a heap when Josiah Wormwell tripped. But not a man lost hold of the line, and though our gain was slow, we brought her up to his churning flukes as near as was safe to go. The mate, he turned to the port gunwale and steadied him on his feet, and lifted the whale line out of the chocks and into the bowing cleat. The boat now ranged abreast of the whale, and soon we had her there, not 6 feet off from his rolling bulk, and his spout was a cloud in the air. To starboard and port the crank boat heeled, and the mate 6 times essayed to sink his lance in the monster's side, but the boat's wild roll delayed. But at last she ran on an even keel for one short instant's space. Then the mate stood high and thrust down deep with an iron look on his face. And as he recovered his twisted lance, he straightened it on the rail, then steadied himself on his feet again and thrust it deep in the whale. Then he suddenly cried, "There's tar, there's tar," as the whale's spout reddened and threw barrels of thick black blood to the sky, which rained in a hideous dew. And the great whale lobtailed and smote the sea with the sound of a cannon shot, while the crimson foam rose up like a wall and the black spout rained down hot. Stern all, we backed away to wait till the whale was dead, while each man sat to his knees in blood and saw his comrades red. Bail out, we bailed with a will, and through the blood-stained air, the seabirds circled and swooped and shrieked and fought for the blood clots there. When the boat was bailed and washed, smoke, oh, the soothing pipe was passed. Each man sank and lay where he dropped, for the fight was finished at last. Each sailor felt that his strength was done. Most grateful it was to feel the fearful tension relaxed at last, and the boat on an even keel. 3 hours it had been, 3 minutes it seemed, as we lay and smoked at ease, though bruised and battered we to the skin and soaked in blood to the knees. And while we waited the coming ship, we watched as the great whale turned his dying head to the crimson disk where the tropic sunset burned. Wood and black skin pull up and lance him, cling like a bulldog that sinks his teeth, bumped on the whale till the planks are shattered, now skimming the red foam, now buried beneath, smothered in steam of his wild spout rising, drenched by the black blood his death spout sends. Grapple him, cling to him, cedar to black skin, and never let go till his great life ends. It's a really remarkable, heroic poem by a Falmouth young man. Pardon? Acushnet. And he is from, he's in his early 20s. He is on this adventure, and he sees the adventure in it. And it's something I think to remember as we look back on whaling, and often tend to have an ahistorical sort of negative view of it. Who were the people that were involved? What was their experience like? And I don't want to romanticize it too much, even though Rupert Swift romanticizes it a great deal, because oftentimes it was a really dangerous business. The number of boats that actually got smashed by whales are many, many fewer than the number of boats that got towed out of sight by a whale and never seen by the ship again. And if you go to the Seamen's Bethel across the street from the New Bedford Whaling Museum, you'll find that there are these cenotaphs on the wall there, and several of them actually give a list of 6 names, and at the bottom it just says towed out of sight by a whale, never seen again. There was also a lot of really hard times when no whales were seen. There are many logbooks and journals that go for weeks and even months waiting to see whales and not seeing any. And sometimes the business was just awful. The number of times that you actually lowered the boats to go after the whales and brought a whale back to the ship was probably only about 20% of the time. A lot of times you went and you lost the gear, the boat got smashed. I'm just going to read a couple of entries from a logbook of a ship called the Bowditch of Bristol, Rhode Island. This was a really extraordinarily successful voyage in terms of the number of barrels of oil that came back. In fact, at one point, they had killed so many whales and were processing them that the cooper could not keep up, the guy who was putting the barrels together to put the oil into it. But they had an extraordinary number of days with really bad luck. So I'm just going to read a couple of entries from a journal of that voyage. Saturday, the 8th of July, 1837, 4 hands sick, a strong breeze from the northern end, very rugged. 3 boats went off to take a whale in tow, but could not find him. This was when they had killed before and then come on aboard again when it got stormy. We did find our whale adrift finally. 1 boat took him in tow. It being so rugged, it tore the stern off her as she came on board. The other 2 boats went to look for the dead whale and could not find him. They fastened to another, killed him, and he sunk 1 boat. Sent another boat off to take the dead whale in tow that we found. The wind shifted, brought him to leeward of the ship, so they left him and came on board for an anchor. Finally, it being so rugged, concluded to let him go. Took the boat up afterwards. It moderated, lowered the boat to go and anchor him. The after tackle hooked into the stern and tore the stern off her. Took her up, and night came on. The other boats came on board. So ends. The larboard and waist boat stove. Hard luck. Saw a great many whales around the ship. So saw a lot, but couldn't get any. Wednesday, the 25th of October of that same year. Strong breeze and rugged. Saw whales, lowered and chased, but did not strike. Came on board toward night, saw whales, lowered and struck, and he took the line. That means that he just went off, and all the line that is in their line tubs, finally when the last of it goes, that's it. The whale is gone. Came on board towards night, saw whales, lowered and struck, he took the line. Came on board and shortened sail, whales blowing us out of the water. At daylight, saw more whales, lowered and struck 1, killed him, and he sank. Capsized the boat and lost the line. So ends that day. The next day, first part, fine weather, saw whales, lowered and struck 1, killed him, and he inclined to sink, but by the aid of 4 boats, we got into the ship. Just at that time, it came on to blow a severe gale from the southwest. We got a large fluke chain onto the whale, and another on his fin, and a stout rope on his head, and made sail on the ship to get offshore. At 3 p.m., we wore ship in order to cut our whale to leeward. When the head rope parted, the whale sunk. We were obliged to wear ship again to bring him up. In coming round, parted the fluke and fin chains, and the whale sunk, and we saw no more of him. Latter part is moderated, so ends this day. And then, a few weeks later, saw whales, lowered and struck 1. He was a real devil. After being fast to him about 4 hours, he went off by taking a line. There was attached to him 12 irons, that's 12 harpoons, 4 lances, 2 lines and a half, 2 drags, 1 spade, and he capsized the starboard boat. Success to him, I say. Really hard. So what happens if you finally do get the whale back to the ship? Whales are bigger than whale ships can handle on deck in the 19th century. And so Americans developed something in the middle of the 19th century called the cutting stage, which allowed them to lower a platform that was 1 board thick over the carcass. So what you see here is a sperm whale is lying alongside the starboard side, and they open up the railing. This is actually not unlike we do on SEA ships to lower our scientific gear. You open the railing, you lower down the cutting stage, and then somebody has to climb down onto the whale's back. They make a hole and they stick a hook into it, and that hook is rigged to a chain that's rigged to a line that goes up aloft to the mainmast, and then through a block and forward to the windlass, which is a winch that can help you lift this heavy piece of blubber up. And so these guys they're standing outside the wall of the ship on the cutting stage. And what this doesn't have is this doesn't have motion. So keep that in mind, that they're going like this. And the whale is bobbing up and down. And they're cutting the blubber into a strip with these very sharp spades that, you see why they have to have blacksmiths on board, because he keeps all this gear moving. So this spade is shaped sort of like this, with a very long handle. You see them with the long handles in their hands. So they're loosening that strip of blubber. It's being winched up aloft, and then when it gets up to the highest point that it can be, you cut it off at the bottom, you attach another hook, and you continue with the next piece. Meanwhile, that big piece of blubber called the blanket piece is either lowered onto the deck or through a big hatch in the deck down below. It's a place that's actually called the blubber room, because especially if you're up in the Arctic, you need to have a place out of the weather where you can process it. And the blubber gets cut up into smaller and smaller pieces, and eventually you can put it into the try-works. These are guys that are actually cutting the blubber from big chunks into something that were called Bible leaves, that they just sliced across it multiple times to expose as much of the blubber to the heat of the try-works as they could. The try-works, which Americans began to bring on board in the middle of the 18th century, really revolutionized the whale hunt. This is what allowed American ships to go out to the Pacific and be away from home for a long time. Prior to the development of the shipboard try-works, all whaling was tied to a shore processing station. So that even the Dutch, going up there into the high Arctic, built their processing stations on places like Svalbard, hunted whales offshore and then brought the whales ashore to process them. That was what had happened on Long Island. It's what happened on Nantucket when they began to whale there. So the shipboard try-works allows them to now process the whales at sea. The try-works is 2 big cast iron kettles that are set into an oven, and that the blubber is not unlike bacon when you put it in a frying pan and you heat it up and the grease melts off of it. That's what happens in this process of trying or rendering the blubber into oil. So the oil comes off of the blubber, and then eventually you just use a dipper. Actually, let me go forward and have a picture of this. This is the sperm whale case. Let me come back to that in a moment. Here's Mr. Lopes, the first mate on the John R. Manta in 1923. This is the last American voyage under sail, whaling voyage under sail. And he's dipping the oil out of the tripod and into a cooling tank. And then it's going to go from there, usually by a hose, down below where the cooper is assembling the barrels and putting the oil into the barrels to bring home. And then what he'll do is he'll take a strainer and he'll take out the burnt up bits that are called the crackling. That's what's left of the blubber when you have taken all the oil out of it. And that's what goes into the fire. So that originally you start the fire with wood, but as soon as you've started to process whales, you have this great oily cracklings that are used for fuel. Herman Melville said that this was where whales were consuming themselves, that their own blubber is being used to keep the fire going. The heads of the whales, no matter what kind it was, either a sperm whale or a right whale, would come on board the ship. And this is actually the case of a sperm whale. Sperm whales have that big head, and inside is an organ called the melon. And in the melon is a slushing, wonderful, waxy oil called spermaceti. And that was separately baled into different barrels so that you always kept the spermaceti oil separate from the body that's rendered, separate from the oil that's rendered from blubber. Because that spermaceti oil has the greatest purity once it's been refined, and it's refined into two products. One is wax, spermaceti wax, and spermaceti candles were made from that. And the other was a really high-grade oil, and this was an oil that was pure enough to be used for watches and chronometers, for sewing machines. And so spermaceti oil was sold as a different product than whale oil, which is rendered from the body. So these are the products then that you're bringing back. How does this all work in terms of setting up the vessel itself? This is an image by Charles Raleigh of a whale ship, the Alice Knowles of New Bedford. This was originally published in the 1876 George Brown Good History of the American Fisheries, which some of you who are interested in fishery stuff might know. And it shows what you see up here. These are barrels that have been made on shore, and then each piece is numbered, and then the barrel is taken apart and tied together. That was what were called the shooks and staves of the barrel, and you could save room in the hold of the ship by storing them like that. And then you have a cooper, who's a member of the crew, who's actually putting the barrels back together as it comes time to put the oil into them. And then, oil as it gets stowed in the vessel. All right, brief little sidelight into Falmouth whaling. Because there were 13 whaling vessels that were registered here in Falmouth. Falmouth was actually Woods Hole at that time. The harbor that we have in Falmouth, which is made from the estuary of a river, was never deep enough in the old days for a big ship. So the ships came in right down here at Barneck Wharf. And in fact, if you were down there this morning to see the Corwith Kramer off on its voyage, you were standing just right near where the whale ships would have been in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. They made 52 voyages between 1820 and 1860. More importantly, 65 Falmouth men commanded 161 whaling voyages. This was a big business for this town. Most of them were actually out in New Bedford, and most of them were in the third quarter of the 19th century. And then one of my favorite families that's so impacted by this, the Lawrences, who lived here in Falmouth, 6 brothers spent a total of 84 years at sea on the decks of American whale ships. I mean, really a sort of extraordinary family adventure, which I did a project on with a class here at Sea Semester in 1997, and we actually did an exhibit at the Falmouth Historical Society and published this little monograph, which is called Whaling Brides and Whaling Brothers, which gives you a hint, too, if you know the movie, what my favorite is. All right. The candle house of MBL, which is down on Water Street in Woods Hole, was a spermaceti candle factory. It's the oldest building in Woods Hole. It has that cool prow of a whale ship coming out of it, and it also has a plaque on it, down on the other side in front of that car, that says that it was built in 1836, and this building was used for the manufacture of spermaceti candles, and as a store and supply house for the outfitting of whaling vessels. And then it gives a list of all the vessels that were built on Barneck Wharf, which is now the Huey Dock. That was a shipyard and also a whaling place. And there were some extraordinary stories that came out of the Falmouth whaling trade. And Mary Chipman Lawrence was the wife of Samuel Lawrence, who was one of the 6 brothers in that family involved in whaling. In 1851, she had a daughter, Minnie, and in 1856, they took off the whole family for a whaling voyage around the globe. They went into the Pacific, they went up into the Arctic, they went around Cape Horn, and in all of this, Minnie was just a wonderful passenger, and Mary wrote a terrific description of the voyage. She was an extremely pious woman. The book is published as The Captain's Best Mate, and actually, I really recommend it if you're interested in whaling, you're interested in the dynamics of what goes on board. But in the course of that voyage, from 1856 to 1860, there were 101 men that served on board it. They left Falmouth with 32 men, of whom 9 were Azorean, and there were others who were African Americans. And when they departed in November of 1856, that crew, only 10 of them would actually return with the ship. Many of them jumped ship in places like Hawaii. A whaling voyage was really hard work. We went around Cape Horn, the worst possible conditions. when you got up to Hawaii and went ashore and it smelled so great, and there were pineapples and coconuts and women and little pigs and all kinds of great stuff, it was very common for men to jump ship. And frankly, the captains did not try to stop a lot of guys from doing that, because once you've left the ship, you've left your wages behind. And there were a lot of guys in Hawaii that had now been there for 6 months and were ready to go home again. So they signed on a new bunch of guys in Hawaii, but among them were actually 15 Hawaiians. So 15 men who spoke the Hawaiian language. Most of them only had very rudimentary English. And Mary Lawrence became very attached to a couple of them, and one of them died up in Alaska. They went up to the Arctic with these Hawaiians. When they came back, the Hawaiians left the ship, came back to Hawaii. More men got on board, but it was a really interesting mixed bag of a crew. I like to think of this voyage actually in terms of the sort of concentric circles on board, that at the heart of it is Mary and Sam Lawrence and Minnie, this little family. And she is constantly trying to maintain the sort of nest of home that she can have on this ship. And around them, the members of the crew are people that she would never have associated with if she had stayed in Falmouth. These were men of color. They were Azorians, people who spoke Portuguese, who spoke Hawaiian. And beyond that is the rest of the whaling fleet. And there were a lot of voyages, a lot of other vessels that they saw while they were out there. In fact, one of the things that will give you some indication of what happened to whales, especially up in the Arctic, is that in 1858 they were here, icy Cape Alaska, and within a period of about 3 weeks, they saw 40 New England whale ships. 17 of them had a woman on board. Mary Lawrence was always extremely pleased if there was a woman, and especially children, that she and Minnie could interact with. She tried very hard not to be affected, not to be changed by the voyage, but of course she was. There was a point on the coast of California where they were going to go ashore and have a picnic, and she's really worried that she has become the sort of savage sailor and won't be able to interact in society anymore, which wasn't true. But she had a really extraordinary experience. These were voyages that changed the landscape of the Pacific. They not only changed Pacific Islanders with a loss of life to disease, with a change of environment, they changed the ways that people thought about things. There's a wonderful journal at the Nantucket Historical Association by a guy named Milo Calkins, who was only 19 years old. And he wrote in his journal as he was sailing away from the Marquesas, "This experience opened up my mind to an entirely new and different train of ideas concerning the past, present, and future of mankind. Many of my preconceived notions imbibed from my sectarian teachings were swept away, and my faith in others badly shaken." So there were a lot of guys, Herman Melville certainly among them, who came into contact with ideas that changed them in the course of a voyage. And Mary Lawrence is another of them. Again, she tries so hard to maintain her values and the system of things that she believes. There's one point when she's in Hawaii, she gets off, the ship goes from the South Atlantic, as most of them did, in the Southern Hemisphere summer, through Hawaii and then up to the Northern Hemisphere in the Northern Hemisphere summer, through the Bering Straits up to the north coast of Alaska. And on one of those trips, she decided that she would stay in Hawaii. And as she's there, she's writing, she's wearing her corset and a dress that's probably made out of wool, and she's writing, "Why do those Hawaiians want to offend me by standing naked outside my door?" So she's, again, she's got her point of view, which she tries very hard not to lose. All right, bringing back those products is what this was all about. This is the upper jaw of a right whale, and there you can see the plates of baleen hanging in it. This is all the plates of baleen. And those will, and actually what you can see in the background too, here's the whale carcass, and here's that strip of blubber that again is attached to something that comes up here and is rigged forward. And these guys here are working the windlass to bring up that big piece of blubber. And actually, if you listen really hard, you can hear them singing. This is the jaw of right whale that shows those long pieces of baleen. You know, if you go to the Harvard Museum of Natural History and you walk around on the mezzanine, they've got these whale skeletons that are hanging there. And I thought actually that the baleen whales had the actual baleen hanging them, but it turns out that it's actually a reproduction that doesn't get quite so messy or snap off so easily when you just barely touch it. Here's to give you the size of them with a man standing next to it. And here is bowhead baleen as it's brought down to San Francisco from the Arctic. And again, the size. This gives you an indication of the size of the whale from the size of the baleen that hangs in its mouth. And that was a big, big product. Here it is, all being ready for processing. And it gets processed into little flexible things that went into collar stays. It was used in umbrella, the bending part of umbrella ribs, right, whips for buggies. And then the biggest use was for torturing women in these corsets. Whalebone is the name of baleen. If you see it as one word, whalebone, it means baleen. If it's two words, it means the skeletal bone. But these were the corsets that have these ribs of whalebone that you then pull tight. They also made skirt hoops were made out of baleen. They were strips of baleen. Baleen's got a real grain to it, which you can see in this piece too. Again, this is really old. When it's fresher, it's much easier to split. But it's got a grain to it, and so it's split along the grain. And the pieces that were about this thick, you could actually make, you would pull them into a circle and staple them together. And you would then put concentric rings, getting smaller and smaller, and you tie them together with ribbons. They look sort of like a bird cage. You step into it, and you pull it up and tie it around your waist, and then you've got this great, sort of bell-like skirt. Of course, you can't sit down or it flips up over. But that was a great fashionable item through the whole of the middle of the 19th century. Oil, a very important product. It really has two purposes. One is for putting into lamps. The other is for using to lubricate machinery of one sort or another. As New Bedford went from being a whaling city to a textile city, the whale oil was the important lubricant for textile mills. There's other products that we think of today. Ambergris was an important one in the 19th century because it had a great value if you found it in the stomach of a sperm whale. Sperm whales eat these giant squid, and the giant squid actually have a beak that's like the beak of a parrot. It's that hard and sort of that size. And so as it scrapes the lining of their stomach, they secreted this material to protect themselves from it, called ambergris. And it has a musky smell, and it was used in, today I think it's still used in the manufacturing of perfume. But in the 19th century, people actually thought that some grains of it in wine, if you drank it, it could, it was a slight aphrodisiac, it was sort of a, pep you up. And there's a great painting by James McNeill Whistler of a woman who's smoking ambergris in a little brazier, and she's got a scarf over her head, and she's inhaling it. So it was, it was a way to get high in the Victorian period. It had some great value. There's another great scene in Moby Dick where they find a rotting sperm whale corpse and try to find the ambergris in it and talk another captain out of taking it. This picture on the left shows the jaw of a sperm whale coming on board, being separated. This gives you a really good picture of what's going on outside the bulwarks of the ship. Here's the davit that's holding the whale boat. So this is the boat that gets lowered down when the time comes. You've seen the whales, you lower the boats and off you go on the hunt. And then when you bring the whale back in, here it is. This is the cutting stage. So again, this is outside the ship. Again, think of this in motion because these guys are on a platform that's going like this. And when they bring the whale's teeth on board, up until about 1820, they actually had a value as a trade item in Polynesia. Whale's teeth had a great symbolic value for Polynesians. And so there were attempts to trade them for sandalwood and other things. But it didn't take very long when American whalemen were going into the Pacific and hiring Polynesians to work on board the ships that the value of those dropped because there were so many of them that became available. So starting in the 1820s, they become available to Americans to work on board ships, and scrimshaw is the art that comes from that. And this is actually the back and the front of the same two teeth, which are so great because on the right there's wife at home standing in the parlor with a carpet and wallpaper and flowers, and in the left is the wahine, the Hawaiian girl standing in the coconut grove. So things to think about while on a whaling voyage. This is my segue into just talking a little bit about what went on out in the South Pacific. In 1852, which is the year that the whaling voyages made over $11 million, it's generally considered to be the height of American whaling. There were more than 150 Yankee whale ships that made a stop in Honolulu. And these were really only from a handful of ports in New England, New Bedford, Nantucket, New London, a couple of other places. impact was great. Several thousand Polynesian men signed aboard New Bedford ships. Some of them actually returned to New Bedford, and in the opening chapters of Moby Dick, Melville talks about seeing Fijians, Tuamotuans, and other Pacific Islanders with their wild specimens of the whaling craft. And in fact, New Bedford was so well known in Hawaii that in 1874, the King of Hawaii visited New Bedford while he was on a visit to the United States. There were a number of attachments to whale products that we can see among Polynesians, including this is a Maori in New Zealand. This is from Cook's first voyage, wearing a sliced sperm whale tooth. And then these Lei named Palaoa were necklaces made out of tiny braids of human hair. And when Cook first arrived there, they had tiny little hooks on them. But as whalemen began to bring in sperm whale teeth and then walrus ivory, the hooks got larger and larger. And so we see numbers of these in museum collections. Whalemen stopped on every island. They encountered people in the Marquesas, where Herman Melville jumped ship in 1841 and stayed in the Nukuhiva Valley, were people that had a tremendous culture. Unfortunately, the presence of outsiders decimated the population. There were a number of epidemics that went through there: smallpox, then measles, then influenza. About 80% of the population died in the 30 years after Melville visited there in 1841. So tremendous losses. But again, whale's tooth, this is a Fijian thing, and I don't want to go on too long, but just to show you that in Fiji, they also wore a sperm whale's tooth across the breast on a fiber of pandanus leaves. And we see these have, in many instances, a sort of little scratching. It's kind of hard for you to see on here, but this is what the Fijians did to decorate them. They're important enough that we see them on one of the Fijian coins. It's called the Tamwa. And this is my favorite one, because this has so much history in it. This is a sperm whale tooth that was engraved by a whaleman in the 1830s, and we know that from the dress she's wearing and other teeth that are similar to it. And then at some point it was traded to a Fijian, who then gave it the marking that was common on Fijian Tamwa. And then it was collected in 1894 by a British guy who was working there in the colonial government. And so all of these, it had served all these various uses, and it's all visible there. Changes, though, that happened there and up in the high Arctic. This is an image by Robert Swain Gifford. Gifford was actually born on Nashwan and lived there his early life. He would have seen the vessels leaving from Woods Hole, the whaling voyages. He went on the Alaska Harriman expedition in 1899, and at that point began to see the tremendous changes that had happened there. For one thing, by this time, bowhead whales, which had been an integral part of the lives of Yupik and Inupiat people, were almost extinct. They've had some comeback in their population, but whales and walruses in a number of areas were entirely depleted. And the impact that had on the local populations was disastrous. There was also a lot of loss of population to disease. George Grinnell, who was on the Harriman expedition with Gifford, actually wrote about being at this very place, Port Clarence, Alaska. He said, "The outlook for the immediate future for these Eskimos is gloomy. Hitherto they have been well cut off from civilization, meeting only the whalers, who are few in number and under a certain rude discipline. But a change has come for the Eskimo. White men, uncontrolled and uncontrollable, already swarm over the Alaska coast and are overwhelming the Eskimo. They have taken away their women and debauched their men with liquor. They have brought them strange new diseases that they never knew before. And in a very short time they will ruin and disperse the wholesome, hardy, merry people whom we saw at Port Clarence and Plover Bay." What he doesn't mention is that decimation of the same stocks both the Americans and the Eskimos were hunting. But it was a tremendous blow to the native people there. Here is the bottom line, and my last slide, that we can see something of the changes that transpired in the Pacific just from the huge numbers of guys that were involved in the industry. More than 2,500 American whale ships made 12,000 voyages to the Pacific Ocean in the 19th century, with over 300,000 men on board. So you can imagine what the impact is to whale populations, to island people, to the introduction of diseases, of new technology, new information. So there's really a couple of different stories to tell here when we talk about whaling. One is what's happening on the ships. One is what's happening off the ships in these various island places, with a perspective from both islanders and Americans. And again, remembering that Americans is not a homogeneous group, that there are a lot of different kinds of guys that are on board. A lot of people who are being influenced by things they see. Minds are being changed, ideas are being changed. But it was also an extremely harsh life. The pay for a whaling voyage was you got a percentage of the final profits in something called a lay. And oftentimes, if you were a green hand on your first voyage, you came aboard not knowing anything. You didn't have any of the right equipment. The captain would sell you stuff out of what was called the slop chest and say, don't worry about it, we'll just deduct it from your wages at the end of the voyage. If you went ashore and you wanted to have sex and you didn't have anything to trade, that's okay, you could get it from the slop chest and they would just deduct it at the end of the voyage. So one of the stories that was frequently told about whaling is that for your first voyage, it wasn't uncommon to come back and find that you owed money to the ship after 4 years away. So I'm going to sing a song here at the end. This is a song that was transcribed into the journal of the ship Ocean Rover of 1859 and describes a little bit of what it is like to be on a ship. Oh, if I had the wings of a goni. I should actually have said that a goni is an albatross. Oh, if I had the wings of a goni, I would fly to my own native home. I would leave desolation's cold, weary ground, for the right whales for us there is none. Oh, the weather is rough and the wind it does blow, and comforts are not to be found there. I would sooner be at home in some Dodge grocery shop, eating crackers and cheese or drinking beer. For a man must be foolish to venture so far on the broad blue expanse catching whales, when he knows that his life is in danger at all times, or his head being smashed by their tails. But whaling has its charms for the young and green hand, and he makes up his mind when he goes. In a very short time he would sooner hear a curse than that unwelcome sound, there she blows. It is first learn the compass with its 32 points, or else lose your whole watch below. But that is not all, to his sorrow he will find 2 hours to the masthead he must go. He descends to the deck with head dizzy and sick, and for life he would not give a damn. When the mate accosts him with, Johnny, my boy, get a rubber and rub down spun yarn. After bearing these trials for well nigh 4 years, the flying jibboom points for home. He's supposed to have 8 or 10 barrels of oil and an equal share of the bone. But he goes to the agent to settle up his voyage, and there he finds cause to repent. He finds he has spent 4 years of his life and not earned a single red cent. On shipboard, and in fact, in the 1750s on Nantucket, there was a man who was, there was a Nantucketer who claimed ownership of one of the men working on a Nantucket whale ship. And at the end of the voyage, the captain decided to give the wages to the man rather than to the owner, and the owner sued the ship. And as a result of that, it's a case that went to the Supreme Court in Massachusetts. That is the case that ended slavery in Massachusetts. Thereafter, though, there's no question that whaling was a way for men to escape from slavery on whale ships were a way you could get out. The other thing, though, is that it became so common to see black men as sailors in many different ports that Frederick Douglass, for instance, escaped from slavery by dressing himself as a sailor and getting on a train. And he had a protection paper of another guy. Yeah?
That process you described, where they lower the boat, fasten the line, let it tow you along, is really kind of involved. How much trial and error, or how much did you go into developing that?
Well, they had used a very similar process actually up in the Arctic, the Dutch from the early part of the 17th century. So Americans didn't make up that part.
The first slide you showed, Neolithic whaling. in
Oh, that's
Korea,
right. That's right.
Russia, Norway,
Right.
exactly the same method of hunting whales as these guys. The only improvements was better boats, better harpoons.
Yeah. Though we don't know if there was a ship involved in that. I think that's probably a shore whaling thing. Yeah. But the small boat whaling, yeah.
The ship only gets you to where the whales are. You don't
Yeah.
hunt the whale in the ship.
I should say my husband, Stuart Frank, is the senior curator at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. So, his work on scrimshaw and especially on songs and poetry has inspired me for the last 30 years.
And I want to report that half of those slides are mine.
I know. Yeah, 30 years, they get a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Why would the whales dive when they were
This,
chased?
I meant to mention this. Whalemen actually are extremely good observers of whale behavior. And so one of the things about whales is that when they first surface, they don't have much oxygen. And so they go through a period then where they're spouting, and, they're inhaling and exhaling. And with different species, they spend a different amount of time at the surface. And you could actually count how many spouts there were and know how long they would spend on the next dive. And so sperm whales, for instance, which go very deep, could spout up to 50 or 60 times and then dive and be gone for an hour. And oftentimes they would come up in the same spot. So the time to strike a whale is not when it's got a lot of air and is ready to dive. The time to strike a whale is when it's recently surfaced. And so this is one of the things that went into observing whales, seeing what was going on. So you definitely don't want to stick your harpoon into a whale that is then going to dive. And so you try to avoid that at all everything you can do. But also, your line that's coming out of those line tubs is not actually tied to your boat. At the end of it is a drag of some sort, which was usually a barrel that was cut down, sealed on both ends. So you would toss that in, and that would slow the whale's progress down. So that even if the whale is breathing and can dive again, which you heard in some of those journal excerpts, that they do sometimes dive, but it was after a fairly long flight. Yeah.
How much rope? A mile?
What's the length of the rope?
1,300 feet.
1,300 feet. And they had one in a boat, but if you've got a whale that's going out a long way and there's multiple boats from your ship, it was not uncommon at all for the next boat to come, tie their line onto your line, and take it. And they had that one really remarkable journal entry where he talks about, this guy went off taking, this whale left with 12 harpoons and 6 lances and 2 miles of line. He had the equipment of a number of boats. Yeah. Different whales.
How fast is the Nantucket sleigh ride?
I don't know in miles per hour. There's a sort of famous movie that you see this guy come down to the sea in ships, and it's frequently shown to illustrate the Nantucket sleigh ride, and that's actually not attached to a whale, it's attached to a little powerboat. So it's not like that. I mean, they're going with a big, bow wake, and everybody's holding on like this.
9 knots.
9, how much?
9 knots.
Really?
Or 1 knot.
Well,
Very fast.
but that was the part of the chase that when Rupert Swift is writing this, narrative, he starts there, which is interesting. It's clearly very, Yeah, gee.
So we have in this day and age OPEC. What kind of collaborative was there on the whale oil coming back to set a price?
There were a number of firms that had shares in multiple voyages. And so nobody owned a whale ship outright, so you would get shares in it. And then the firms had brokers, and I don't know more than that. Do you want to say anything about that, sir?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a simple commodities market. Prices went up and down depending on supply and demand, and the strength of the import market, and the value of insurance premiums on ships. And so that it worked pretty much like pork bellies and concentrated frozen orange juice.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, New Bedford was founded because there was a cartel owned mostly in Boston, Providence, and Newport that controlled the entire catch. Josiah Quincy, John Hancock Sr. and Jr., and a bunch of Jewish immigrants from Spain controlled this whole thing. And 2 families on Nantucket didn't like it, and they moved to New Bedford to start their own racket. And they were the ones that really developed their own commodities market.
You know, there was usually 32 shares of a ship, and you could buy, you could buy half of them, you could buy an eighth of them, you could buy a quarter of them. Interestingly enough, on Cape Cod, they also divided up cranberry bogs that same way. Yeah, the influence of Cape Cod.
Probably does the same thing with birthday cake.
How much do you want to invest, right?
I always thought ambergris came from the sperm whale's head in your hands.
No, that's spermaceti comes out of the head cavity. Ambergris is created in the stomach. And one of the reasons why ambergris, you could still buy ambergris when all other whale products were embargoed after the Marine Mammal Protection Act is because whales can bark it up. Yeah.
It also comes out the other way.
I know, but yeah.
The old stone docks in front of Falmouth there along the beach.
Yeah.
Were they ever, although they were there just a short while, were they ever used, were whaling ships?
No, actually there were some whale ships that, if I understand this correctly, the way they were launched is they were actually launched sideways from the beach in Falmouth, rather than, sliding down away because the water's so shallow there. But I think that most of what you see there in that stonework was salt works.
Yeah.
That there were evaporating ponds there for getting salt out of seawater. Yeah.
You mentioned the Captain's Specimen
Yeah.
by Mary Lyons. There's a book that's very popular with the staff at Mystic Seaport called Whale Hunt by
Nelson Cole Haley.
That's right.
Yeah, Haley was on a voyage of the Charles W. Morgan, which is the ship that they hold there. So it's a ripping good book. It's a, oh, I'm sorry, finish your question here, Rob.
Well, my question is, it was written by Haley
Yeah.
when he was decades
Yes.
older, and it's a voyage when it began when he was 17.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense for how much of it is factual versus yarn or embroidered? Or
I think most of the details of the hunt are absolutely correct in it, and so is a lot of the dynamics of he's a wonderful writer. I think that the writing of it is probably something that he had thought of over the years, but I actually think that's a ripping good whaling yarn myself. And some of the images in it, I will never forget. I mean, one of my favorites is they stop in the Hawaiian Islands, they pick up a bunch of little piglets, and the piglets are, they have a pen on board, but the piglets are short enough that they can run under the bottom stick of the pen. And so they're all over the deck, and he talks about, the ship rolls like this, and a little picture. And he said that you had to be really careful when you went from the bow to the stern, that you had to balance there, and then you had to time it just perfectly, or you get caught in the great avalanche of hockey. He has over the years, I think, romanticized that in his mind, but still, we know that they carried, live animals on many ships, and then.
I just want to add, I'm glad to hear that you like it. When I was teaching Moby Dick in high school, Whale Hunt is a perfect companion to the high opera of Moby
Absolutely,
Dick.
yes.
And sort of the three-penny opera.
Yeah.
What it was
See,
actually like.
I actually don't think Moby Dick should be taught in high school, but Whale Hunt is, yes, great. Yeah.
In the economics of it, how much did the ship cost, and how, could it get paid for in one voyage or 10 voyages, or what kind of?
I've read through a lot of shipping papers, and
1845, you could build a whale ship for just over $25,000. Equip it and outfit it for a whaling voyage for just over $25,000. And in a series of fairly good voyages, you can pay for it in 3 voyages, which is 9 to 10 years. And many vessels were able to make up even more than the $50,000 outlay in the first voyage, and some vessels never made it, just like business elsewhere. But basically, you're building a ship for a 10-year payback. And a 20-year life expectancy. The Charles W. Morgan was at sea for 81 years, so sometimes you got a lot more out of it.
The number of men going out there not only dying and risking their lives, is there any tie into the early days of life insurance on the East Coast?
I don't know. Sorry, but it's a really good question. I'll go home and Google it, as I'm sure many of you will as well. Yes.
Mary, I wondered if you want to say anything about something that's mentioned in Mary Lawrence's account about the Falmouth room at the Bethel in Honolulu.
Yeah, that actually is a really interesting account of stopping in Honolulu, and while she's there, she goes to the Seamen's Bethel. And the Bethels were built by Protestant religious organizations But they actually had in the one in Honolulu, something that they called the Falmouth Room. And they raised money in Falmouth churches to furnish this room. And it actually had a picture of Reverend Damon, who was the minister at her church here in Falmouth when she went in there. So that was for her a really wonderful thing to see. But it shows, I think, that there was, again, Mary Lawrence is really interesting because these are not guys that she generally would have cared all that much to meet, even though she would have been willing to donate the money for them to be religiously educated when they were off on their voyages. But the fact that she goes on this voyage changes her perspective of that a lot. To go to that place, to see that room to which she had donated money was a really interesting experience for her. Yeah?
What was it that really killed the golden age of whaling?
Well, the things that are generally told are the discovery of petroleum in the ground, which made the demand for oil less. There was a big, the introduction of new technology. In fact, this picture with the vessel that you see off there is the Marian Helen, which is the first of the auxiliary steam-powered whaling vessels. But the Civil War, stopped whaling to a very large extent, where the Confederacy could not really attack a lot of other kinds of American vessels. They concentrated on whale ships, and they captured whale ships, they burned them. The Union actually had a bunch of decrepit old ships and decided to send them down and sink them full of rocks in harbors in the South in order to destroy those harbors. And then after the Civil War in the 1870s, there were two big disasters in the Arctic. 33 ships lost in 1871, and a few years later another dozen ships. And at that time, people in New Bedford are starting to recapitalize into textiles. Is one of the things is that you could make more money in a different industry. And so even though around the globe, people continued to hunt whales with the introduction of new kinds of technologies. I mean, the Norwegians, for instance, really take off even as Americans are declining. And Americans will adopt some of that technology, but it was possible with a big powered ship as opposed to a sailing vessel to catch species which had never been hunted before. And also, they actually could bring an air compressor on board, shove a pipe into a whale carcass and blow it up like a balloon and keep it afloat. So whales that hadn't been hunted under sail, like blue whales and finback whales, begin to be hunted in an age of new technology. And Americans just simply didn't get into it in any big kind of way. Whaling came back in the 60s and 70s, attached to shore whaling stations on the West Coast for Americans, where they used some of that new technology. But for the most part, that technology just went to other places. Any other questions? Thank you all so much for coming.